Welcome back to Forgotten Cars. Today, we're uncovering 7 secret GM pickups that almost everyone forgot. Some were ahead of their time, some were surprisingly unusual, and others were simply overshadowed by more famous Chevrolet and GMC trucks. But why did everyone forget them? Subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments which GM pickup surprised you the most. Let's get started.
1939 Chevrolet Master Series pickup, the Chevy that history forgot. Why did this stylish pre-war Chevrolet disappear behind the trucks that came after it? When you picture a classic Chevrolet pickup, you probably imagine one of the famous post-war trucks. But several years before those icons appeared, Chevrolet was already experimenting with something very different. The 1939 Chevrolet Master Series pickup looked less like a basic work machine and more like a small automobile with a cargo bed. That was a big change for the late 1930s. American pickups were still primarily tools. They were expected to haul equipment, deliver goods, and survive hard work. Style wasn't exactly the priority. But Chevrolet was beginning to understand that truck buyers were also drivers. They wanted something that was practical, but they also wanted something that looked good. And the 1939 Chevy reflected that idea. Its rounded bodywork gave it a much more sophisticated appearance than earlier pickups. The front end looked increasingly like Chevrolet's passenger cars. The fenders flowed smoothly around the body. The cab was more comfortable, and under the hood was Chevrolet's familiar 6-cylinder engine. It wasn't trying to be a sports car, it was trying to make the working truck better to live with, and that's what makes this pickup interesting. Chevrolet was quietly moving the American truck toward the future. The truck was becoming less primitive, more comfortable, more attractive, more automobile-like. But then, history took a completely different direction. By 1941, America was approaching World War II, and shortly afterward, civilian automobile production would be dramatically affected by wartime demands. The automotive industry changed. Factories changed priorities. Materials became restricted, and ordinary passenger vehicles were no longer the center of attention. The 1939 Chevrolet belonged to the last generation of American pickups before that enormous disruption. That's part of the reason it feels so unusual today. It's a snapshot of America before the war changed everything. Imagine walking into a Chevrolet dealership in 1939. The world is still relatively normal. You see shiny new cars, you see trucks designed for farmers and businesses, and sitting there is this stylish, rounded Chevrolet pickup. It looks modern, it looks comfortable, but nobody knows what is coming. Within a few years, the American automobile industry will be transformed. And after the war, Chevrolet will introduce a completely new generation of trucks. Those later trucks will become famous. The 1939 model will slowly disappear from public memory. That's the irony. The trucks that came after it became icons. The 1939 Chevy became a footnote. But it deserves more attention because it helped establish a design philosophy that would become extremely important. A work truck could also look like an automobile. That idea sounds completely normal today, but in the 1930s, it was still developing. Chevrolet was making the cab more comfortable, the styling more aerodynamic, the body more integrated, the overall truck more appealing to ordinary drivers. And that mattered because pickup trucks were becoming increasingly important in everyday American life. Farmers needed them, small businesses needed them, delivery companies needed them, tradesmen needed them. The pickup wasn't just a specialized commercial vehicle anymore. It was becoming one of the most useful vehicles an ordinary American could own, and Chevrolet wanted its trucks to reflect that idea. The six-cylinder engine also fit the philosophy. It wasn't about extreme performance, it was about dependable power, a working engine for a working vehicle. The combination made sense. Simple mechanical design, useful cargo capacity, more comfortable cab, and styling that didn't look like a box on wheels. But there's another reason the 1939 Chevrolet is easy to forget. It wasn't built to become a collectible. It was built to work. And work trucks have a difficult life. They get loaded. They get driven on rough roads. They get repaired. They get modified. They get exposed to weather. And when they finally become too old to work, many are simply discarded. A beautifully preserved passenger car might spend decades in someone's garage. A work truck usually doesn't get that kind of treatment. That's why seeing an original example today can feel almost like discovering a time capsule. You're looking at a vehicle from an America that no longer exists. A vehicle built before the highways, before the suburbs, before the modern pickup culture, before the post-war boom transformed the country. And yet, you can already see the future in its design. The rounded body, the car-like front end, the more comfortable cab, the idea that a truck could also look attractive. These were all signs of where the pickup was going. After World War II, Chevrolet would take these ideas much further. The famous advanced design trucks would arrive. They would become some of the most recognizable American pickups ever built. And suddenly, the earlier Chevrolet trucks would be overshadowed. That's how automotive history works. The successful generation becomes famous, and the generation that helped make it possible gets forgotten. The 1939 Master Series is one of those forgotten links. It sits between the old-fashioned work trucks of the early 1930s and the modern pickups that would dominate the next era. That's what makes it so fascinating. It wasn't quite the old truck, but it wasn't yet the modern pickup either. It was the transition, and transitions are often the easiest things to forget. Think about what Chevrolet was trying to accomplish. The company didn't need to reinvent the pickup completely. It simply needed to make it better, more comfortable, more attractive, more useful, and more familiar to people who were already buying Chevrolet cars. That strategy would eventually become extremely successful. But the 1939 truck didn't get to enjoy the full benefits of that future. History interrupted. War came, production changed, and the automotive world moved on. By the time America returned to normal civilian production, Chevrolet's new trucks were ready to take center stage. The old 1939 model was left behind. And that's why today, when people talk about classic Chevrolet pickups, they often jump directly to the post-war era. But if you go back a little further, you find trucks like this, a Chevrolet that was already trying to make the pickup more than just a work tool. It was trying to make it something people could actually enjoy driving. And that idea would eventually transform the entire truck market. So the mystery remains. Why did this stylish pre-war Chevrolet disappear behind the trucks that came after it? Because the trucks that followed became legends. The 1939 Chevrolet was simply one of the stepping stones that helped Chevrolet get there. But without those early experiments, the modern American pickup might look very different. It wasn't the Chevrolet pickup everyone remembers. It was the Chevrolet pickup that helped make those famous trucks possible.
2. 1946 GMC EC150 pickup. The GMC that history forgot. Why did this post-war GMC become almost invisible while its Chevrolet relatives became classics? When you think about post-war American pickups, Chevrolet usually gets the spotlight. The famous advanced design trucks, the rounded bodies, the iconic grills, the classic Chevrolet badge. But there was another GM truck arriving at almost the same moment, and today far fewer people remember it,
the 1946 GMC EC-150. And its story begins with a country that had just survived World War II. For years, American factories had been focused on the war effort. Cars and civilian trucks were no longer the priority. But when the war ended, everything changed. America suddenly needed trucks again. Farmers needed them. Businesses needed them. Construction companies needed them. Delivery services needed them. And millions of Americans were ready to rebuild their lives. That created an enormous demand for practical vehicles. GMC was ready to answer. The EC series represented GMC's return to the civilian truck market after the war, and the EC-150 was one of its light-duty pickups. On paper, it sounds straightforward: a practical truck, a useful cargo bed, a proven mechanical package, a design suited to everyday work. But there was something much more important happening. America was entering the post-war boom, and trucks were about to become more important than ever. Imagine the situation in 1946. Factories are switching back to civilian production. Construction is beginning to accelerate. Farm equipment needs to be transported. Businesses need deliveries. Cities need rebuilding. And families are buying homes and starting new lives. A pickup wasn't a luxury. For many people, it was an essential tool. GMC understood that. The EC-150 was designed to go straight into that new post-war economy. But here's where the story gets strange. The truck was part of the same GM family as Chevrolet, yet Chevrolet would eventually become far more famous among collectors. Why? Part of the answer is branding. GMC and Chevrolet were closely related. In many cases, their trucks shared engineering and basic architecture. But Chevrolet had a much larger passenger car customer base. Chevrolet was everywhere. Millions of Americans already knew the Chevrolet name. When someone thought about buying a new vehicle after the war, Chevrolet was an obvious choice. GMC had a stronger identity around trucks. That sounds like an advantage, but it also meant the brand had a smaller audience, and that difference would matter enormously decades later. Because when collectors started looking backwards, Chevrolet had a huge cultural advantage. More surviving vehicles, more buyers, more recognition, more nostalgia. GMC trucks were often overlooked. The EC-150 is a perfect example. It wasn't necessarily strange. It wasn't some bizarre engineering experiment. It wasn't a spectacular failure. It was simply a good working truck. And sometimes those are the vehicles history forgets first. Think about how many of these trucks probably spent their lives. A farmer buys one. He uses it every day. It carries feed, tools, parts, equipment, maybe firewood, maybe supplies from town. The truck gets dirty, it gets scratched, it gets repaired. Years later, another owner buys it, then another. Eventually, it's too old to justify keeping, and the truck disappears. Nobody thinks, we should preserve this because it will be historically important. They think, it's an old work truck. That's one of the biggest reasons early pickups became so rare. They were tools, not treasures. And the EC-150 was exactly that kind of machine, a post-war workhorse. But there's something fascinating about the design. It came from a moment when American truck styling was changing rapidly. Before the war, trucks often looked extremely utilitarian: separate fenders, tall bodies, simple cabs, little attention to comfort. After the war, manufacturers began moving towards more integrated designs, better visibility, more comfortable interiors, smoother bodywork, more automobile-like proportions. The EC-150 sits right in the middle of that transition. It's a reminder that the modern pickup truck didn't suddenly appear. It evolved step by step, generation by generation, and GMC was part of that evolution. The timing also makes the truck historically significant. 1946 was the beginning of a completely new American era. The war was over. American industry was switching back to civilian production. Veterans were returning home. Families were growing. The economy was expanding, and the automobile was becoming central to American life. The pickup truck was right there in the middle of it. The EC-150 was one of the machines helping Americans rebuild. But history tends to remember the glamorous side of the post-war era, the chrome, the new cars, the highways, the suburbs, the famous Chevrolet and Ford trucks. The GMC EC150? It gets much less attention, and that's exactly why it fits this story. Because this truck represents something that doesn't always make it into automotive history, the ordinary machines that helped build extraordinary times. It didn't need to be revolutionary, it needed to work. And that's what GMC was offering, a dependable light-duty truck for a country that suddenly needed thousands of them. The EC150 was part of a much larger transformation. Before the war, the pickup was primarily a commercial and agricultural tool. After the war, it was becoming part of everyday American life. People used trucks for business, but they also began using them for transportation, for family life, for construction, for recreation. The pickup was becoming more versatile, and GMC was competing for that market. But Chevrolet had a huge head start in public recognition. That's the frustrating part of the EC150 story. The truck wasn't necessarily forgotten because it was bad. It was forgotten because something more famous was standing right beside it. The Chevrolet name became synonymous with classic post-war pickups. The GMC badge became the quieter sibling, and over time, the difference became even larger. Collectors started chasing famous Chevrolet models. Parts became easier to find for them. More people restored them. More were photographed. More were featured in magazines. And the GMC trucks slowly faded from the spotlight. But when you see an EC150 today, it tells a different story. You're looking at one of the trucks that returned America to normal life after World War II. A truck built for a country that was about to experience an enormous economic boom. A truck that represented the beginning of a new era. And suddenly, this forgotten GMC becomes much more interesting. Because it wasn't just another old pickup, it was part of the post-war reset of American transportation. And that's why the question deserves an answer. Why did this post-war GMC become almost invisible while its Chevrolet relatives became classics? Because Chevrolet had the larger name, the larger audience, and eventually the stronger collector culture. But the GMC EC150 was there too, working, hauling, delivering, helping businesses reopen, helping farms recover, helping America get moving again. It didn't become an icon. It became something much quieter, a survivor from the moment America went back to work. And perhaps that's exactly why we should remember it. The Chevrolet became the classic. The GMC became the forgotten workhorse. 3. 1954 Chevrolet Advanced Design 3600, the Chevy everyone forgot. Why is the famous Chevrolet 3100 remembered everywhere, while the heavier 3600 is often ignored? When people picture a classic 1950s Chevrolet pickup, there's one truck that almost always comes to mind, the Chevrolet 3100. The rounded body, the famous grille, the smooth fenders, the unmistakable advanced design look. But sitting just above it was another truck from the same family, the Chevrolet 3600. And despite sharing the same iconic design, the 3600 rarely gets the same attention. That's strange, because the 3600 wasn't some obscure experimental vehicle. It was a serious working pickup. The 3/4-ton Chevrolet. And for people who needed more carrying capacity than the 3100 could provide, it was the truck that made sense. The story begins after World War II. America was changing rapidly. Construction was booming, businesses were expanding, farms were modernizing, and Americans were buying more trucks than ever before. Chevrolet had already created a successful pickup formula with the Advanced Design series. The idea was simple. Make the truck useful, but also make it comfortable and attractive. The 3100 became the most famous version of that formula. But Chevrolet knew not everyone needed a half-ton pickup. Some buyers needed more payload, more strength, more capability. That's where the 3600 came in. It kept the same recognizable advanced design styling, but underneath that familiar body was a truck designed for heavier work, and that difference mattered. Imagine a small contractor in 1954. He needs to carry lumber, tools, building materials, maybe equipment for several workers. A 3100 might be enough for some jobs, but if the loads get heavier, you need something more capable. The 3600 was Chevrolet's answer. It wasn't trying to be flashy, it wasn't trying to become a collector's favorite, it was designed to work harder. And that may actually be why it's forgotten. Because the 3100 became an icon of American automotive design. The 3600 became a tool, and tools tend to disappear into history. Think about what happened to these trucks after they were sold. They weren't parked in climate-controlled garages. They were driven every day, through dirt, through snow, through rain, loaded with heavy materials, used on farms, used by contractors, used by businesses. And when they became old, many were simply retired. The 3100, on the other hand, eventually became associated with classic car culture. Collectors loved its proportions, restorers loved the styling, and the truck became one of the most recognizable vintage pickups in America. The 3600 had the same beautiful body, but its heavier-duty identity made it less fashionable. That's the irony. The truck was arguably more useful, but less celebrated. And that makes the 1954 Chevrolet Advanced Design 3600 fascinating, because it shows how much of automotive history is determined by image. Two trucks can share the same styling, they can come from the same manufacturer, they can be built in the same era, yet one becomes an icon while the other almost disappears. The advanced design styling itself was revolutionary in its own way. Compared to earlier pickups, the design was much more integrated. The cab was wider, visibility was improved, the interior was more comfortable, the front end was unmistakably Chevrolet, and the overall shape looked much more like a complete automobile. This was important because Chevrolet was trying to make trucks easier to live with. The truck wasn't just something you drove because you had to, it was becoming something you could spend hours inside. That mattered to working Americans. A farmer could spend an entire day driving. A contractor could travel between job sites. A delivery driver could spend hours behind the wheel. Comfort was becoming part of the equation. But Chevrolet didn't forget about capability. That's where the 3600 came in. It gave buyers more carrying capacity without forcing them into a much larger commercial truck. That was an important middle ground. You didn't need a giant truck, you needed a stronger pickup, and the 3600 provided exactly that. It's easy to overlook how important this category was. The American pickup market wasn't simply divided into small truck and huge truck. There were many different levels of capability: half-ton, three-quarter-ton, 1 ton, and beyond. Each was designed around a different job. The 3600 was aimed at the customer who had moved beyond the lightest pickup. Maybe his business was growing. Maybe his farm was getting bigger. Maybe his loads were getting heavier. He needed more truck, but he still wanted something manageable. That was the role of the 3600, and Chevrolet was very good at filling these gaps. But there's another reason the truck gets overlooked. The 3100 has become a symbol of the 1950s. You see one and immediately think classic American pickup. The 3600 doesn't have the same instant recognition, even though visually it can look almost identical. That's an interesting lesson. Sometimes the most famous vehicle isn't necessarily the most important one. The 3100 became the poster child. The 3600 was doing the work behind the scenes, and that work was significant, because the success of Chevrolet's truck lineup depended on offering different levels of capability. The company wasn't selling one truck, it was selling an entire range, and the 3600 was an important part of that strategy. There's also something fascinating about surviving examples today. A restored 3600 can look almost like a 3100 at first glance, but once you know what you're looking at, you realize you're seeing something different, a heavier-duty version of one of America's most famous pickup designs. And suddenly, the truck becomes much more interesting, because it's not just another classic Chevy, it's the forgotten workhorse behind the classic. Think about the people who originally bought these trucks. They weren't thinking about collector value. They weren't thinking about future auctions. They weren't thinking about Instagram photos. They were thinking about tomorrow's work. Can it carry the load? Can it survive? Can it get me where I need to go? That's what mattered. And the 3600 was built around those questions. The truck represents a very important period in American history. The country was becoming wealthier, suburbs were expanding, businesses were growing, construction was booming, and trucks were becoming essential to that growth. Every new house needed materials, every farm needed equipment, every small business needed transportation. The 3600 was part of that infrastructure. It wasn't glamorous, but it was useful. And usefulness is often what drives real economic growth. That's why the truck deserves more recognition. It wasn't just a heavier version of a famous Chevrolet. It represented the growing demand for trucks that could do more. And that demand would only increase. Over the following decades, pickups would become larger, stronger, more powerful, more comfortable, and eventually 3/4-ton trucks would become an enormous part of the American market. The 3600 was an early example of that evolution. So, when you look at the 1954 Chevrolet Advanced Design 3600, don't just see an old Chevy. See a truck caught between two worlds. It still had the beautiful styling of the classic post-war pickup, but underneath it was becoming something more serious, more capable, more specialized, more powerful. And perhaps that's why it's so easy to forget. It wasn't the truck that changed the way people looked at pickups. It was the truck that helped change what people expected them to do. And that's why our mystery remains. Why is the famous Chevrolet 3100 remembered everywhere, while the heavier 3600 is often ignored? Because the 3100 became an icon, the 3600 became a workhorse. One ended up on posters, the other spent decades carrying loads. But without trucks like the 3600, the story of the American pickup would be incomplete. The 3100 became the legend, the 3600 was the workhorse that helped build it.
4. 1955 GMC 150. The GMC that Chevrolet overshadowed. Why did GMC's own version of the mid-1950s pickup get buried under Chevrolet's fame? By the mid-1950s, the American pickup truck was changing fast. The old idea of a pickup as nothing more than a farm or work machine was beginning to disappear. Trucks were getting better looking, more comfortable, more powerful. And manufacturers were starting to realize that buyers wanted something they could actually enjoy driving. GMC was right in the middle of that transformation, and one of the trucks representing it was the 1955 GMC 150. At first glance, it might look like just another classic GMC, but look closer and there's an interesting story hiding behind it. Because GMC was trying to establish something that Chevrolet already seemed to own, the American pickup market. The problem? Chevrolet had an enormous advantage. Everyone knew the Chevrolet name. Chevrolet cars were everywhere. Chevrolet dealerships were everywhere. And Chevrolet's trucks were becoming increasingly popular. GMC, meanwhile, had a much stronger reputation as a truck-focused brand. That gave GMC credibility, but it also made it harder to compete for the emotional attention of ordinary buyers. And the 1955 GMC 150 arrived right in the middle of that battle. This was an important period for GMC. The company wanted its pickups to look modern, not simply functional, not simply durable, modern. The truck received updated styling that reflected the design trends of the mid-1950s. The body looked smoother, the cab looked more sophisticated, the front end had more presence, and GMC was beginning to give its trucks a stronger visual identity. But the company wasn't abandoning performance. GMC trucks were known for strong engines and serious work capability. That mattered, because GMC's traditional customer wasn't necessarily looking for the cheapest truck. They wanted something that could work hard, something dependable, something with a little more muscle, and the 150 was designed to provide exactly that. But here's where things become interesting. Imagine walking into a GM dealership in 1955. You see a GMC pickup, then you see a Chevrolet pickup. They are obviously related. They share much of the same basic engineering philosophy, but Chevrolet has a much more recognizable name among ordinary car buyers. Which one do you think most people remember? Probably the Chevy. And that's exactly what happened. Chevrolet became the cultural face of GM's light-duty pickups. GMC became the quieter sibling. Not necessarily worse, not necessarily less capable, just less famous. And over time, that difference became enormous. The 1955 GMC 150 is a perfect example. It existed during one of the most exciting periods in American truck design. Chrome was becoming more important. Styling was becoming more dramatic. Americans were buying larger and more powerful vehicles. The economy was booming, and the pickup truck was beginning to move from the farm into everyday life. But when people remember the 1950s pickup revolution, they usually remember Ford and Chevrolet. GMC is often an afterthought. That's unfortunate, because GMC was doing some genuinely interesting things. The company understood that truck buyers wanted more than simple utility. They wanted comfort, they wanted power, they wanted something that looked good, and the 150 reflected that philosophy. It was still a work truck, but it was increasingly becoming a personal vehicle. That transformation was important. The American pickup was no longer necessarily something you bought because you had no choice. You could buy one because you liked it. You could drive it every day. You could take it into town. You could use it for work during the week and for recreation on the weekend. The 1955 GMC 150 existed right at that turning point. But there's a cruel irony. The better these trucks became, the easier it was for their Chevrolet relatives to steal the spotlight. Chevrolet had the advantage of a massive passenger car business. Millions of people already associated the brand with American life. That meant Chevrolet could bring buyers into the pickup market more easily. Someone who already owned a Chevrolet car might naturally choose a Chevrolet pickup. GMC had to convince them to choose something different, even if the truck was excellent. That's a difficult battle, and history eventually rewarded the bigger name. Today, the Chevrolet trucks of this era are instantly recognizable. Collectors search for them, restorers build them, they appear in movies, they appear at classic car shows. They have become symbols of 1950s America. The GMC 150? Far fewer people can identify one. That's what makes finding one today so interesting. You can look at the truck and think, wait, GMC built this? And that reaction is exactly why it belongs on a forgotten trucks list. Because it isn't forgotten because some bizarre engineering failure. It isn't forgotten because it was ugly. It isn't forgotten because nobody wanted it. It's forgotten because it lived in the shadow of one of the biggest automotive names in America, Chevrolet. The 1955 GMC 150 was fighting the same battle that many GMC trucks would fight for decades. How do you create your own identity when your corporate relative is already dominating the conversation? GMC tried. The styling became more distinctive, the engines became more powerful, the trucks developed their own personality. But Chevrolet's reputation was simply enormous. And that's the strange part of the story. Two trucks could come from the same industrial family. Two trucks could share many engineering ideas. Two trucks could serve the same customers, yet one could become a legend while the other slowly disappeared from memory. That's exactly what happened to the GMC 150. But if you step back and look at the truck historically, it becomes much more important. This was America in the middle of 1955. The economy was growing, the suburbs were expanding, highways were improving, American families were becoming more mobile, and the pickup truck was changing along with the country. It was becoming more comfortable, more powerful, more stylish, and more personal. GMC was part of that revolution. The 150 wasn't simply another work truck, it was part of the process that transformed the pickup into the vehicle we recognize today. The truck could haul, it could tow, it could work, but it could also look good doing it. And that's a major reason the 1950s became such an important era for American pickups. The manufacturers were learning that utility and style didn't have to be enemies. A truck could be both. GMC understood that. The problem was that Chevrolet understood it too and had a much bigger audience. So the GMC 150 became something of a forgotten middle child.
Important enough to matter, good enough to compete, but never famous enough to dominate the history books. And perhaps that's why seeing one today feels so unusual. It's like discovering an alternate version of the classic American pickup story. You recognize the era immediately, but the badge is different. The shape feels familiar, but the truck isn't the one you've seen 1,000 times. And suddenly you realize GMC was there too. It was building the same kind of truck. It was chasing the same buyers. It was participating in the same revolution. It simply didn't receive the same attention. So the mystery remains. Why did GMC's own version of the mid-1950s pickup get buried under Chevrolet's fame? Because Chevrolet had something GMC couldn't easily compete with: brand recognition on a massive scale. Chevrolet became the face of the American pickup. GMC became the forgotten alternative. But that doesn't make the 1955 GMC 150 less interesting. If anything, it makes it more interesting, because this truck represents the road not taken, the version of America's pickup story that could have been much more famous. Chevrolet got the spotlight. GMC did the work in the shadows.
5. 1959 Chevrolet El Camino, the car that became a pickup. Why did Chevrolet turn a family car into a pickup and almost abandon the idea? Imagine walking into a Chevrolet dealership in 1959 and seeing something that looks like a full-size family car. Long hood, huge body, chrome everywhere, elegant styling. But then you look behind the cabin, and there's a pickup bed. What? This was the 1959 Chevrolet El Camino, and at the time it was one of Chevrolet's strangest ideas. Because Chevrolet wasn't simply building another pickup, it was asking a completely different question. What if a family car could also be a truck? That sounds normal today, but in 1959 it was a bold experiment. America was obsessed with big cars. Cars were getting longer, wider, more powerful, and covered in chrome. The automobile had become a symbol of success. But people still needed practical vehicles. Farmers needed cargo space. Businesses needed something to haul equipment. Families needed transportation. So Chevrolet tried to combine both worlds. The El Camino was based on Chevrolet's full-size passenger car design. Instead of starting with a traditional truck and making it more comfortable, Chevrolet went in the opposite direction. It started with a car and turned it into a pickup. And that's what made it so unusual. From the front, it looked like a Chevrolet passenger car. From the side, the long body and sweeping lines made it look almost like a station wagon. But behind the cabin was an open cargo bed. It was one of those vehicles that made people stop and ask, "What exactly am I looking at?" And Chevrolet had a reason for building it. The company had noticed something interesting happening in the market. There were people who wanted the usefulness of a pickup but didn't want to drive a traditional truck. They wanted something more comfortable, more stylish, more like a car. And Chevrolet believed those customers might be willing to buy a vehicle that gave them both. The idea wasn't completely new. Other manufacturers had experimented with car-based pickups, but Chevrolet was taking the concept into the world of big American cars. And in 1959, that meant something enormous. The El Camino was based on a full-size Chevrolet, so this wasn't a tiny utility vehicle. It was a huge American car with a truck bed. That's part of what makes the first-generation El Camino so visually strange. It wasn't trying to hide the fact that it was a car. It embraced it. The front end looked like a passenger car. The interior was car-like. The ride was more familiar to automobile buyers, but the back was designed to carry cargo. It was essentially two vehicles combined into one, and for a moment it looked like Chevrolet might have discovered something important. But then the market gave Chevrolet a problem. The late 1950s were not the easiest time to sell a vehicle like this. The American economy was changing, consumer preferences were shifting, and buyers weren't necessarily rushing to purchase such an unusual combination. The El Camino was too car-like for traditional truck buyers and perhaps too truck-like for ordinary car buyers. That was the fundamental problem. Who exactly was this vehicle for? A farmer? Maybe. A businessman? Possibly. A family? Perhaps. A young driver? Definitely. But there wasn't yet a massive customer base demanding this kind of vehicle. And Chevrolet discovered that the concept wasn't as easy to sell as it looked on paper. The first-generation El Camino had a relatively short life, and Chevrolet temporarily abandoned the idea. That's the part that makes the story so interesting, because today the El Camino is legendary. People remember it as one of the most distinctive American vehicles ever built. But in 1959, Chevrolet didn't know whether the idea would work. The company was experimenting, and the experiment didn't immediately become a success. That's a common pattern in automotive history. A vehicle can fail commercially and still become historically important. The El Camino is a perfect example, because the basic idea was simply too early. Americans hadn't fully embraced the idea of a pickup as a lifestyle vehicle yet. The pickup was still strongly connected to work. A car was for transportation, a truck was for hauling. Why combine them? That was the question Chevrolet was trying to answer, and perhaps America wasn't ready yet. But Chevrolet wasn't completely wrong. The idea had potential. It just needed the right moment. And eventually, that moment would arrive. A few years later, Chevrolet would bring the El Camino concept back, and this time the market was different. Americans were becoming more interested in sporty cars. Younger buyers wanted something different. The muscle car era was approaching, and the idea of a stylish car-based pickup suddenly made much more sense. The El Camino would return and eventually become one of Chevrolet's most recognizable nameplates. But that later success makes the 1959 version even more fascinating, because the first El Camino was the experiment. It was Chevrolet asking, will America buy this? The answer was essentially, not yet. And that's why the 1959 El Camino is so important. It represents an idea that arrived before the market was ready. Think about the design philosophy. Instead of making a pickup more luxurious, Chevrolet made a car more useful. That's completely backwards compared to how trucks had traditionally evolved. And yet, decades later, the same basic concept would become incredibly popular. The modern pickup market is full of vehicles designed to blur the line between car and truck. Comfortable interiors, luxury features, sporty styling, family-friendly cabins, vehicles that can work but don't feel like work vehicles. The El Camino was an early expression of that idea. It was saying you don't have to choose. You can have a car and a truck in the same vehicle. But there was a problem. The 1959 version was simply enormous. American cars were enormous, and that made the concept even stranger. Imagine trying to park this thing. The front looks like a luxury family car, the rear looks like a pickup, and the entire vehicle is built on the scale of late 1950s America. It was bold, maybe too bold, but that's what Chevrolet was known for. The company wasn't afraid to experiment, and sometimes those experiments became legends. The El Camino eventually became exactly that, but the first-generation version remains one of the most fascinating chapters, because it shows how uncertain the idea originally was. Today, nobody questions what an El Camino is, but in 1959, Chevrolet was essentially inventing a new category. Not exactly a car, not exactly a truck, something in between. And when you create a new category, there's always a risk that customers won't understand it. That's what happened. The El Camino didn't immediately become a mainstream success. Chevrolet moved on.
But the idea refused to die. And that's perhaps the most important part of the story. A concept can disappear without actually being dead. Sometimes it simply needs the right moment. And El Camino eventually found that moment. So when you look at the 1959 Chevrolet El Camino, don't just see a strange old car. See one of Chevrolet's boldest experiments. A vehicle that challenged the traditional definition of a pickup. A vehicle that asked whether Americans really needed to choose between a car and a truck. In 1959, the answer wasn't clear, but Chevrolet had planted the seed. And years later, that seed would become one of the most recognizable car-truck hybrids in American history. So the mystery remains. Why did Chevrolet turn a family car into a pickup and almost abandon the idea? Because Chevrolet had the right idea, but the market wasn't ready yet. The first El Camino wasn't a failure of imagination, it was a case of bad timing. And sometimes being too early is almost as dangerous as being wrong. Chevrolet built the car pickup before America knew it wanted one.
6. 1964 GMC Handy Van Pickup. The tiny GMC that went against America. Why did GM believe America was ready for a tiny pickup when everyone wanted bigger trucks? In 1964, America had a problem that seems almost impossible today. American trucks were getting bigger. Bigger engines, bigger bodies, more chrome, more power, more space. The typical American pickup was becoming a symbol of strength and size. And then GMC did something completely different. It introduced a tiny pickup based on the Handy Van. At first glance, it almost didn't look American at all. The cab was pushed far forward. The engine was tucked beneath the front area. The body was compact and upright. And compared with a full-size GMC pickup, it looked almost miniature. But GMC wasn't trying to compete with the biggest trucks. It was trying to create something completely different. A small truck that used space intelligently. And that was a radical idea for America in the 1960s. Think about what was happening at the time. American buyers loved big cars. The roads were getting wider. Suburbs were expanding. Gasoline was relatively inexpensive. And horsepower was becoming a major selling point. The bigger the vehicle, the more impressive it seemed. So why would anyone want a tiny pickup? GMC had a very specific customer in mind. Small businesses, delivery companies, service workers, urban businesses, anyone who needed cargo capacity but didn't need a giant truck. The Handy Van's biggest advantage wasn't power. It was space. By moving the driver and passenger forward and using a cab-over design, GMC could make the vehicle much shorter without giving up as much usable cargo room. That meant a surprisingly practical little machine. It could fit into places where a full-size pickup couldn't. It was easier to maneuver. It was easier to park. And for a business working in crowded cities, that could be extremely valuable. But to an American buyer in 1964, it looked strange. Almost too strange. The traditional pickup had a long hood, separate front fenders, a large engine compartment, a long bed. The Handy Van-based pickup broke almost every one of those visual rules. The cab was pushed forward. The body was boxy. The proportions were completely different. It looked more like a delivery vehicle, because that's essentially what it was. GMC was taking the practicality of a commercial van and turning it into a pickup. And that was clever. But clever doesn't always mean popular. The biggest challenge was American culture. The pickup truck was becoming a symbol. A big truck said something about its owner. Strength, Independence, capability, freedom. A tiny truck didn't send quite the same message. If anything, it looked like the opposite. And GMC was asking buyers to think differently. Instead of "how big is your truck?" GMC was effectively asking "how efficiently can your truck use its space?" That was a much harder idea to sell, especially in 1964. But there was another factor working in its favor. Cities were changing. Urban deliveries were becoming more complicated. Parking was becoming more difficult. Businesses didn't always need a huge truck. A bakery didn't need a V8 pickup to deliver bread. A plumber didn't necessarily need a massive truck. A repair company could benefit from something compact. For those customers, the handy van concept made perfect sense. The problem was that this wasn't the America most people imagined when they heard the word pickup. The American pickup was still associated with farms, construction sites, and open roads. The handy van belonged somewhere else. The city. And that distinction mattered. GMC was essentially anticipating a market that would become much more important later. Compact commercial vehicles. Small urban delivery trucks. Efficient work vehicles. Vehicles designed around maneuverability rather than brute force. Today, that concept is completely normal. But in the 1960s, it was still unusual. And the handy van pickup was one of those experiments that showed GMC was thinking ahead. There was also something fascinating about the engineering. The cab-over layout allowed GMC to shorten the overall vehicle. Instead of wasting a large amount of space on a traditional hood, the driver sat much farther forward. That created a compact footprint. The truck could carry useful cargo without becoming enormous. It was almost like GMC was solving a mathematical problem. How do you fit the most useful truck into the smallest possible space? The answer was the handy van. And the pickup version took that philosophy even further. But there's a reason people today often don't remember it. It was never the kind of truck that became a cultural icon. The big GMCs became associated with American truck culture. The handy van became associated with work. It was a commercial tool. And just like many other work vehicles, its owners used them until they were worn out. Few people thought about preserving them. Few people imagined that decades later, collectors would be hunting for them. That's how vehicles like this disappear. Not because they were necessarily bad, but because they were useful. And useful vehicles are often used until they're gone. The handy van pickup also existed during a fascinating period in American automotive history. The 1960s were full of contradictions. On one side, America was building enormous V8 cars. Muscle cars were becoming legendary. Big pickups were getting more powerful. But at the same time, smaller vehicles were beginning to appear. Compact cars, small vans, economical commercial vehicles. And eventually, Japanese manufacturers would enter the American market with even smaller pickups. The handy van concept was part of that broader change. It showed that there was room for a different kind of American truck. Not necessarily bigger, not necessarily more powerful, just smarter. And that's what makes this GMC so interesting. It wasn't trying to beat a full-size pickup at its own game. It was changing the game. Instead of asking, how much power can we give this truck? GMC was effectively asking, how efficiently can your truck use its space? That was a much harder idea to sell, especially in 1964. But there was a chance it might work. Cities were changing. Urban deliveries were becoming more complicated. Parking was becoming more difficult. Businesses didn't always need a huge truck. A bakery didn't need a V8 pickup to deliver bread. A plumber didn't necessarily need a massive truck.
A repair company could benefit from something compact. For those customers, the handy van concept made perfect sense. The problem was that this wasn't the America most people imagined when they heard the word pickup. The American pickup was still associated with farms, construction sites, and open roads. The handy van belonged somewhere else. The city. And that distinction mattered. GMC was essentially anticipating a market that would become much more important later. Compact commercial vehicles. Small urban delivery trucks. Efficient work vehicles. Vehicles designed around maneuverability rather than brute force. Today, that concept is completely normal. But in the 1960s, it was still unusual. And the handy van pickup was one of those experiments that showed GMC was thinking ahead. There was also something fascinating about the engineering. The cab-over layout allowed GMC to shorten the overall vehicle. Instead of wasting a large amount of space on a traditional hood, the driver sat much farther forward. That created a compact footprint. The truck could carry useful cargo without becoming enormous. It was almost like GMC was solving a mathematical problem. How do you fit the most useful truck into the smallest possible space? The answer was the handy van. And the pickup version took that philosophy even further. But there's a reason people today often don't remember it. It was never the kind of truck that became a cultural icon. The big GMCs became associated with American truck culture. The handy van became associated with work. It was a commercial tool. And just like many other work vehicles, its owners used them until they were worn out. Few people thought about preserving them. Few people imagined that decades later, collectors would be hunting for them. That's how vehicles like this disappear. Not because they were necessarily bad, but because they were.
7. 1967 Chevrolet C10 Fleetside. The pickup became personal. When did Chevrolet realize that people wanted their pickup to be more than just a work truck? For decades, the American pickup had one simple job: work. You bought one to haul something: tools, lumber, farm equipment, supplies. A pickup didn't need to impress anyone, it needed to survive. But by the late 1960s, something was changing. Americans were beginning to look at trucks differently, and Chevrolet was paying attention. One of the clearest examples was the 1967 Chevrolet C10 Fleetside. At first glance, it was still a pickup. It had a cargo bed, it had a sturdy chassis, it could haul heavy loads. But Chevrolet was beginning to understand that buyers wanted something else too. They wanted a truck they could enjoy driving. And that was a major change, because the pickup was slowly leaving the farm and entering everyday American life. Think about the America of 1967. Muscle cars were everywhere. Young buyers cared about styling. Cars were becoming more comfortable. People wanted more options, and vehicles were increasingly becoming expressions of personality. The automobile wasn't simply transportation anymore, it was part of someone's identity. Chevrolet realized the pickup couldn't remain behind. So the C10 Fleetside became part of a new philosophy. The truck should still work, but it should also look good. The Fleetside design was especially important. Instead of the traditional exposed rear fenders of a step-side truck, the bed flowed more smoothly with the body. The result was cleaner, more modern, and much more like a passenger vehicle. That might seem like a small styling decision. It wasn't. It changed the way the pickup looked on the road. The truck suddenly appeared less like a commercial machine and more like a vehicle someone might choose because they simply liked it. That distinction would become enormously important, because Chevrolet wasn't just selling capability anymore, it was selling choice. A buyer could order different engines, different trim levels, different options, different interiors, different configurations. The pickup was becoming customizable, and customization is one of the foundations of the modern lifestyle truck.
The more choices Chevrolet offered, the easier it became for buyers to build a truck around their personality. A basic work truck? Sure. A comfortable daily driver? Absolutely. A stylish weekend vehicle? That was becoming possible too. And the C10 was right in the middle of this transformation. But the interesting question is, why did Chevrolet make this change? Because the customer was changing. The post-war generation was growing up. Young Americans were entering adulthood. They had more disposable income. They were buying cars based on style and performance. And some of them wanted trucks. But they didn't necessarily want the bare-bones work trucks their fathers had driven. They wanted something more comfortable, more attractive, more personal. Chevrolet saw the opportunity, and the C10 was perfectly positioned for it. The truck still had the practical foundation of a traditional pickup, but it was becoming much easier to live with. Better ride, better interior, more options, more attractive bodywork, and increasingly more emphasis on appearance. This was the beginning of a major cultural shift. The pickup wasn't necessarily something you bought because you needed it. You could buy one because you wanted it. That's a very different market. And once manufacturers realized that people were willing to buy trucks for emotional reasons, the entire industry changed. Think about what would come later. Sport packages, special editions, luxury interiors, four-wheel drive, off-road models, large engines, comfort features, premium trim. Eventually, trucks would become some of the most expensive and desirable vehicles on the market. But that future needed an important first step. The pickup had to become desirable. The 1967 C10 was part of that process, and the fleet-side body helped enormously. The smoother bed made the truck look more integrated, more sophisticated, less agricultural. It could sit in a suburban driveway without looking completely out of place. That was important. Because America was becoming increasingly suburban. People were moving away from farms and city centers. They were buying houses, building garages, working in offices. But they still liked the idea of owning a pickup. The truck could help with home projects, carry furniture, tow a trailer, go camping, and still serve as everyday transportation. The C10 fit perfectly into that lifestyle. It was practical enough for work, but attractive enough for everyday driving. And Chevrolet was learning something important. The truck didn't have to choose between the two. It could be both. That's one of the reasons the C10 became so influential. It helped redefine what a pickup could be. Not just a work vehicle, not just a commercial tool, but a personal vehicle. A vehicle that could represent its owner. A vehicle that could be modified, customized, restored, driven for fun. And that's exactly what happened. Over time, the C10 became deeply connected to American custom truck culture. People began lowering them, changing wheels, upgrading engines, restoring original examples, building show trucks. The pickup had become a canvas, and that would have been almost unthinkable a few decades earlier. In the 1930s, nobody was buying a work truck because they wanted to build a show vehicle. By the late 1960s, the idea was becoming much more realistic. But there's another reason the 1967 C10 matters. It arrived during a major technological and cultural transition. American vehicles were becoming more sophisticated. Consumers expected more comfort. Manufacturers were learning how to sell options and packages, and competition was becoming intense. Ford had the F-Series. Dodge had its own increasingly stylish pickups. GMC was fighting for buyers. Chevrolet couldn't afford to let its trucks remain simple work machines. It needed to give buyers a reason to choose a Chevy, and styling was one of the easiest ways to do that. The C10 didn't need to become a sports car. It simply needed to feel more modern, more refined, more desirable, and it did. The late 1960s Chevrolet pickup looked like it belonged to the same world as the cars people were driving. That was the breakthrough. A pickup could now sit next to a muscle car and not look completely primitive. It could have style. It could have personality. It could have attitude. And once buyers experienced that,
The old definition of a truck started disappearing. But the transformation wasn't complete yet. The C10 was still absolutely capable of working. That's what made the idea so powerful. Chevrolet didn't replace utility with style, they combined them. A contractor could use it, a farmer could use it, a family could use it. A teenager could want one, and a collector could eventually treasure one. One vehicle, many identities. That's the foundation of the modern pickup market. And the 1967 C10 helped establish it. There's something almost ironic about this. The truck wasn't revolutionary because it had some unbelievable engine. It wasn't revolutionary because it could carry an enormous load. It was revolutionary because of how Chevrolet positioned it. The company was beginning to sell the pickup as something more than equipment. It was selling a lifestyle. And that idea would eventually turn the American pickup into one of the most important vehicles in the country. The old pickup was built to work. The C10 was built to work and to be wanted.